Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting slowly into the most captivating mysteries that have kept the Five Nights at Freddy's community theorizing for over a decade now. From the earliest debates about which bite truly happened when, to the modern questions surrounding digital entities and robotic children. This franchise has given us endless puzzles to solve in the quiet hours. Whether you're here to hear familiar theories that have shaped your understanding of the lore, discovering interpretations you've never considered before, or simply letting these ideas wash over you like a gentle tide as sleep takes hold, this will carry you through the most compelling questions that still echo through Freddy Fazbear's halls. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive exploration that unfolds like a dream. And let me know in the comments which theory you find most convincing, or which mystery keeps you up at night wondering about the truth. It's always fascinating to see how different minds approach the same clues, finding patterns in the shadows that others might have missed. Let's begin. The Great Bite Debate. When did it really happen? In the early days of Five Nights at Freddy's, Phone Guy's casual mention of the bite of 87 in the very first game sparked what would become one of the franchise's longest-running debates. That single line, delivered with such matter-of-fact brevity about someone losing their frontal lobe to an animatronic, seemed straightforward enough at the time. The community immediately began speculating about which animatronic was responsible, with Foxy taking the primary spot in early theories due to his out-of-order status and those sharp, gleaming teeth that seemed built for something more sinister than entertainment. When Five Nights at Freddy's 2 arrived and revealed itself as a prequel set in 1987, the community felt certain they were about to witness the infamous incident firsthand. The toy animatronics, particularly Mangle, with her ability to traverse the pizzeria freely and her similarly sharp dental work, became the new prime suspect. Phone Guy's warnings grew increasingly urgent throughout that game, mentioning the animatronics' erratic behavior and the building's lockdown status during an investigation. The stage seemed set for a dramatic revelation, and when Jeremy Fitzgerald's shift on the day shift for the birthday party came around, many players held their breath expecting to see the bite unfold in real time. Yet even after the game's completion, the identity of the biter remained frustratingly ambiguous. The gameplay itself provided no clear answer, and the community was left to piece together hints from Phone Guy's dialogue about staying close to the animatronics during the party, ensuring no one got hurt. The failure to prevent harm, the subsequent lawsuits mentioned in later installments, and the new regulations about animatronics being confined to the stage during the day, all pointed to something catastrophic happening. But which animatronic was responsible? The evidence remained circumstantial at best. Then Five Nights at Freddy's 4 arrived and threw everything into beautiful chaos. The game opened with what appeared to be another bite entirely. This one taking place at Fredbear's family diner, and clearly dated to 1983, based on the television Easter eggs and various environmental clues scattered throughout the minigames. We watched as a terrified child, tormented by his older brother and friends, was lifted toward Fredbear's mechanical jaws in what was meant to be a cruel prank. The animatronic's mouth clamped shut with devastating force, and the sound of crying mixed with the crunch of metal on bone painted a horrifying picture that would haunt the series going forward. This revelation split the community down the middle. Some theorists argued that this was the bite Phone Guy mentioned all along, that perhaps he simply misspoke, or the date was retconned. After all, the visual evidence was right there on screen. We saw a child's head placed into an animatronic's mouth. We saw the jaws close. We saw the aftermath in the hospital room, where the child lay surrounded by pills and flowers and the steady beep of medical equipment. How could this not be the infamous bite of 87 that had sparked so much speculation? Others insisted that the existence of two separate bite incidents made perfect narrative sense within the franchise's dark history. Fazbear Entertainment's track record of safety violations and cover-ups certainly supported the possibility of multiple catastrophic failures across different locations and time periods. The specific mention of someone losing their frontal lobe and surviving, which Phone Guy noted with some amazement, seemed to better fit a scenario involving the more advanced toy animatronics with their facial recognition software and precise movements, rather than the older spring-lock technology of Fredbear that crushed with indiscriminate mechanical force. The evidence for two separate incidents grew stronger as more games released and the timeline became clearer. The 1983 date for the crying child's death at Fredbear's family diner aligned perfectly with other established events in that year, including the opening of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and the early stages of William Afton's descent into madness. The bite of 87, meanwhile, seemed intrinsically linked to the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, happening during the day shift on November 14th, 1987, when Jeremy was asked to work the birthday party. Phone Guy's description of the incident emphasized the survival of the victim despite the traumatic brain injury, suggesting a bite that was severe but somewhat controlled, perhaps interrupted before the full force of the animatronic's jaw could complete its deadly work. This matched better with the toy animatronics, whose more sophisticated programming might have allowed for a partial retraction once the facial recognition system detected something wrong, even if that reaction came too late to prevent serious injury. Fredbear's spring-lock mechanisms, by contrast, were all or nothing. When those locks failed, they failed completely, with crushing force that left little room for survival, much less the kind of recovery that would allow someone to live without a frontal lobe. The debate continues to this day because both positions hold merit within the franchise's established lore. Some fans have even proposed compromise theories, suggesting that the crying child somehow survived the 1983 incident only to be involved in or witness the 1987 bite, creating a tragic through line that connects both events through a single victim's perspective. Others point to Mangle's jump-scare animation specifically targeting the frontal area of the player's vision as a deliberate hint from Scott Cawthon about the true culprit of the 87 incident. What makes this debate so enduring is that it represents one of the franchise's core tensions between explicit storytelling and interpretive mystery. Scott Cawthon deliberately crafted his lore to reward close attention while maintaining enough ambiguity to fuel discussion. The existence of two bites, both significant enough to shape the trajectory of Fazbear Entertainment's policies and reputation, speaks to the systemic failures that plague the company throughout its history. Whether you believe in one bite or two, whether you think Mangle or Fredbear or some other animatronic was responsible, the truth remains that these incidents represent the ultimate betrayal of the animatronic's intended purpose as sources of joy and entertainment for children. The bite debate also highlights how the community itself has evolved in its approach to FNaF theories. In the early days, theories were built on small details and educated guesses. Now, with over a decade of games, books, and supplementary materials, theorists can cross-reference multiple sources, looking for patterns that span the entire franchise. The bite discussion has become less about finding a definitive answer, and more about understanding what these incidents reveal about the darker themes running through every Freddy Fazbear location. The inevitable consequences of cutting corners on safety, and the human cost of treating living beings, whether flesh or spirit-possessed metal, as disposable entertainment. Golden Freddy. The fifth victim's identity crisis. Among all the mysteries that haunt Five Nights at Freddy's, few are as persistently debated as the true identity of the spirit inhabiting Golden Freddy. This ethereal animatronic, appearing and disappearing without following the normal rules that govern its mechanical brethren, has been at the center of countless theories since the very first game. The slumped, lifeless posture in the office, the way it vanishes when you raise the monitor, and that distinctive phrase, "It's me," that appears whenever Golden Freddy manifests, all pointed to something fundamentally different about this entity. But who exactly was the child whose death gave rise to this spectral presence? The commonly accepted answer, built on years of careful analysis and Easter egg hunting, identifies a child named Cassidy as possessing Golden Freddy. This name emerged from the survival logbook through an elaborate puzzle that required players to use altered page numbers as coordinates in a word search, spelling out CASSIDY letter by letter. The discovery felt definitive at the time, particularly when paired with the sixth gravestone shown at the end of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, which remained obscured while the other 5 missing children were finally laid to rest. Sources have presented Cassidy's gender differently across various media, with some materials suggesting female and others male, adding another layer of ambiguity to this character's identity. What remains clear is that Cassidy represents the fifth victim, the one who many believe refused to move on, whose anger and desire for vengeance kept them tethered to the mortal world long after the others had found peace. But as with everything in this franchise, certainty quickly gave way to complexity. The logbook also revealed what appeared to be a conversation between 2 entities, one communicating through faded text and another through altered words. The faded text seemed to be asking questions about the past, inquiring about things only the crying child from Five Nights at Freddy's 4 would know. Does the Fredbear plush still talk to you? Do you remember your name? These questions suggested that perhaps Golden Freddy's haunting wasn't as simple as a single vengeful spirit, but rather something more complicated. Something involving multiple souls sharing the same ethereal space. This gave rise to the Golden Duo theory, which proposes that both Cassidy and the crying child, sometimes called Evan, or simply referred to as the bite victim, inhabit Golden Freddy together. The evidence supporting this interpretation is compelling in its own way. Andrew and Jake in the Fazbear Fright stories demonstrated that 2 spirits could indeed share a single vessel, communicating with each other and maintaining separate identities while occupying the same physical form. The Stitch Wraith's dual nature provided a parallel that many theorists felt was too specific to be coincidental. The "it's me" phrase that Golden Freddy is so strongly associated with takes on new meaning under this interpretation. If Michael Afton is indeed the player character in Five Nights at Freddy's 1, then "it's me" becomes a desperate attempt at communication from his younger brother, trying to remind Michael of his identity and the tragedy that connects them. The guilt that Michael carries over his role in his brother's death would make these encounters with Golden Freddy particularly poignant, transforming what appeared to be random supernatural attacks into family tragedy playing out across the veil between life and death. Yet the golden duo theory faces its own challenges when examined against other evidence. The single pair of glowing eyes that appears in Golden Freddy's various manifestations suggests one consciousness rather than two. The way Golden Freddy fades away entirely in the Happiest Day minigame, rather than partially, implies a single soul finding rest, rather than one spirit moving on while another remains. And perhaps most significantly, the characterization of the one you should not have killed in Ultimate Custom Night seems to point toward a singular focused consciousness rather than a shared identity struggling with internal division. This vengeful spirit, keeping William Afton trapped in an eternal nightmare, exhibits a level of concentrated malice and purpose that seems at odds with the idea of two souls sharing control. The tormentor speaks in singular terms, uses singular pronouns, and maintains a consistent personality throughout the various death lines and cutscenes. If two spirits inhabited Golden Freddy, one would expect some evidence of internal conflict or differing perspectives. Yet the entity presents as unified in its hatred and determination to make Afton suffer without end. Some theorists have attempted to reconcile these contradictions by proposing that while two spirits may inhabit Golden Freddy, one has taken a dominant role, particularly in the post-death torment of William Afton. Cassidy, as the more vengeful of the two, would be the primary consciousness keeping Afton trapped in Ultimate Custom Night, while the crying child's presence might be more passive, perhaps even trying to convince Cassidy to let go, as suggested by the Old Man Consequences minigame, where the red bear fades into the lake, potentially representing one spirit finally finding peace while the other remains. The truth might be that Golden Freddy's identity has evolved across the franchise as Scott Cawthon's vision for the story developed. The early games may have conceived of Golden Freddy as simply the fifth victim of the missing children's incident, while later installments introduce complexity through the crying child story, creating connections that weren't originally planned but fit well enough within the established lore to be incorporated retroactively. This isn't a failure of consistency so much as a natural evolution of a narrative that has grown far beyond its initial scope. What remains undeniable is that Golden Freddy represents something more than just another haunted animatronic. Whether inhabited by one soul or two, whether that soul is Cassidy alone or accompanied by the crying child, this entity stands apart from the other spirits in both power and purpose. The ability to manifest without a physical suit, the teleportation-like appearances, and the resistance to moving on even when given the opportunity all mark Golden Freddy as exceptional within the franchise's supernatural hierarchy. The debate over Golden Freddy's true identity matters because it shapes our understanding of the franchise's emotional core. If Cassidy alone haunts the Golden Bear, then we have a story about vengeance taken to its ultimate extreme, a child so wronged that even death and the passage of decades cannot cool the fires of their rage. If the crying child shares that space, then we have a story about brothers separated by death and bound by tragedy, about guilt that echoes across generations, and about the possibility of forgiveness even in the darkest circumstances. Both interpretations offer rich emotional terrain to explore, which is perhaps why the community remains so thoroughly divided on which version represents the truth. Michael Afton, A Life Lived in Shadows. The identity of Michael Afton and his journey through the games represents one of the most universally accepted theories in the entire Five Nights at Freddy's community. Yet it's built on circumstantial evidence and careful interpretation rather than explicit confirmation. This theory proposes that Michael Afton the older brother who tormented the crying child in Five Nights at Freddy's 4, is actually the player character in multiple games across the series, working under the alias Mike Schmidt in the original Five Nights at Freddy's and potentially Fritz Smith in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, all while seeking redemption for his past mistakes and attempting to stop his father's dark legacy. The foundation of this theory rests primarily on the survival logbook, that deceptively simple book that has provided more lore revelations than many of the mainline games. The logbook is explicitly addressed to Mike, and throughout its pages we find references that only make sense if this Mike is actually Michael Afton from Sister Location. Drawings of the exotic butters, references to the immortal and the restless soap opera that plays in Sister Location, and sketches of Nightmare Fredbear all suggest that the person filling out this security logbook has experienced events that Mike Schmidt from Five Nights at Freddy's 1 should have no knowledge of, unless he's actually Michael Afton in disguise. The name itself provides an interesting connection. Mike is a natural shortened form of Michael, suggesting an alias that's close enough to his real name to respond to naturally, but different enough to avoid immediate recognition by anyone searching employment records for William Afton's son. Schmidt, meanwhile, could be his mother's maiden name, a common choice when someone wants to establish a new identity while maintaining some connection to their past. This would allow Michael to work at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza without raising suspicions about his connection to the company's troubled co-founder. The firing notice at the end of Five Nights at Freddy's 1 provides what many consider to be the smoking gun evidence for this theory. Mike Schmidt is terminated for tampering with the animatronics and for odor. That second reason seemed like a darkly humorous touch when the game first released, a joke about how terrifying the nights must be, perhaps causing the guard to sweat profusely in fear. But after Sister Location revealed Michael's fate at the hands of Enard, being scooped and used as a skin suit before being discarded as a rotting purple corpse that somehow continued to walk and talk, that odor citation took on horrifying new significance. A decomposing body would certainly produce an odor, even one animated by supernatural means or remnant-infused determination. The fact that Michael continues to function after what should be certain death, his skin taking on a purple hue as decay sets in, suggests something fundamentally altered about his physical existence. If he's working as a night guard at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in this state, the smell of death would be inescapable, no matter how much he tried to maintain a normal appearance. Management would notice something deeply wrong, even if they couldn't quite identify the source of their discomfort. The tampering with animatronics charge also makes perfect sense for Michael Afton's character and situation. As a skilled technician who survived a week working in Circus Baby's entertainment and rental, he would have both the knowledge and motivation to examine the animatronic's internal workings. Perhaps he was searching for evidence of his father's experiments with Remnant. Perhaps he was trying to understand the nature of the possession that animated these machines. Perhaps he was even attempting to free the spirits trapped within, offering them some measure of peace as penance for his role in his brother's death. Whatever his exact motivation, tampering with the very animatronics that management insisted must never be disturbed would be entirely in character for someone on a personal mission that superseded company policy. The theory extends to Five Nights at Freddy's 2 as well, with many fans proposing that Fritz Smith, the custom night guard who is fired for the same reasons as Mike Schmidt, tampering with animatronics and odor, might also be Michael Afton. The similarity in firing reasons, combined with the timeline placement, supports this connection in the eyes of many theorists. If Michael is indeed trying to undo his father's legacy by working at these locations, it would make sense for him to have been at the 1987 location as well, possibly investigating his father's activities during that period, or attempting to understand the possession phenomenon affecting the animatronics. Some theorists have even proposed that Michael might be the protagonist in Five Nights at Freddy's 3, working as the guard at Fazbear's Fright when his father's corpse is discovered in the sealed safe room and brought to the horror attraction. The phantom animatronics that haunt that game could be manifestations drawn from Michael's own guilt and memories, his mind conjuring images of the characters that have defined his cursed existence. This would explain why he seems to have such vivid hallucinations of animatronics from multiple time periods, and why the experience feels so personal despite the location being new. What makes Michael Afton's journey so compelling is how it reframes the player's experience across multiple games. Instead of playing as random security guards who happen to get caught up in supernatural events, we're actually following one man's quest for redemption across years or even decades of his life. Every Night Survived isn't just about making it to 6 a.m. for a paycheck. It's about Michael confronting the consequences of his family's actions, facing down the spirits his father wronged, and trying to find some way to make things right despite the impossibility of truly undoing the damage that's been done. The monologue at the end of Sister Location's Custom Night, where Michael addresses his father directly, has become one of the most quoted passages in the entire franchise precisely because it captures this arc so perfectly. "I'm going to come find you," Michael says, his voice steady with determination, even as his body falls apart around him. The promise isn't made out of love or loyalty, but out of a bone-deep need to stop William Afton from causing any more harm. Michael has become something neither fully alive nor truly dead, sustained by willpower and perhaps remnant, existing in the shadows because his appearance would frighten anyone who saw him, all in service of hunting down his father and ending the nightmare. This theory transforms Five Nights at Freddy's from a series of disconnected survival horror experiences into a coherent character study. Michael Afton starts as a bully, a cruel older brother who thought it was funny to terrorize a younger sibling, never imagining the prank would end in tragedy. That single mistake defines the rest of his existence, driving him to seek redemption, even when redemption seems impossible, pushing him to continue fighting even after death should have claimed him. He becomes the ghost in the machine, working within his father's system to undermine it. Using the security guard positions that William likely helped establish to access the very animatronics that carry the evidence of William's crimes. The community's acceptance of this theory, despite its lack of explicit confirmation, speaks to how well it fits with the established facts and how much narrative satisfaction it provides. Michael Afton, as the protagonist of multiple games, gives the series emotional continuity, transforming isolated horror experiences into chapters in one man's impossible quest. It provides motivation for why someone would keep returning to these deadly locations night after night. It explains anachronisms and oddities that might otherwise seem like plot holes. And most importantly, it gives the player a character to root for, someone whose determination in the face of overwhelming horror becomes genuinely inspiring rather than simply masochistic. Whether Mike Schmidt, Fritz Smith, and the other guards are all Michael Afton, or whether some of them are separate individuals caught up in the Afton family's nightmare. The theory that Michael is seeking redemption through these roles has become central to how most fans understand the series' overarching narrative. It's a story about how mistakes can haunt us long past the moment they're made, how family bonds persist even across death, and how some sins demand a lifetime and beyond to atone for. The crying child, promised to be put back together. Few lines in Five Nights at Freddy's have generated as much discussion and interpretation as the promise made to the crying child in his final moments. "I will put you back together." Whispered by an ambiguous voice, possibly the Fredbear plush that has watched over him throughout the game, or perhaps William Afton himself, speaking through a hidden speaker. These words have become a cornerstone of multiple theories about what happened to the bite victim after the tragedy at Fredbear's family diner. Did he die from his injuries, his soul moving on to possess an animatronic like the other victims? Did William somehow resurrect him through technological means? Or does his story extend far beyond 1983, continuing into the modern era in ways we're only beginning to understand? One widely discussed interpretation is that the crying child died in the hospital, and his spirit went on to possess Golden Freddy, either alongside or instead of Cassidy, depending on which version of that theory you subscribe to. The connection between the child and Fredbear is undeniable. He was killed by Fredbear, his final moments defined by those mechanical jaws closing on his head. The Fredbear plush was his constant companion throughout his short life, a source of comfort that made promises about protection and companionship. From this perspective, if any animatronic would become the vessel for his spirit, Fredbear or Golden Freddy seems like the logical choice, particularly given Golden Freddy's unique properties and its clear thematic connection to the Afton family tragedy. The Happiest Day minigame in Five Nights at Freddy's 3 has been interpreted by many as supporting this theory. We see a child at a birthday party receiving cake from the puppet, surrounded by other children wearing masks of the main animatronics. The layout mirrors the crying child's birthday party from Five Nights at Freddy's 4, but transformed into something joyful rather than traumatic, potentially representing a happiest day to replace the worst day of this child's existence. When the final child puts on the Golden Freddy head and the spirits all fade away, this could represent the crying child finally finding peace and moving on, with the promise of being put back together fulfilled in the form of a healed soul rather than a resurrected body. However, this interpretation remains debated, as the identity of the birthday child in Happiest Day isn't explicitly confirmed. But William Afton's character and his growing obsession with conquering death suggests a darker, more literal interpretation of that promise. After witnessing his son's death, William might have dedicated himself to actually putting the child back together in a physical sense, using his skills as a roboticist and his growing understanding of remnant and possession to create a mechanical vessel that could house his son's consciousness, or at least simulate it convincingly enough to ease William's grief. This interpretation casts much of William's subsequent actions in a different light, suggesting that the initial murders and experiments with the animatronics weren't purely about satisfying sadistic urges or achieving personal immortality, but about a father's twisted attempt to resurrect his lost child. The sister location private room's observation of the house from Five Nights at Freddy's 4, the nightmare animatronics that seem too sophisticated to be mere nightmares, and the general setup of that game all hint at experimentation that goes beyond simple security monitoring. If William was testing fear responses on the crying child, either before or after the bite, It suggests a level of cold calculation that sits uncomfortably with the image of a grieving father. Unless, of course, William convinced himself that these experiments were necessary, that understanding fear and the connection between strong emotions and supernatural phenomena was key to bringing his son back from death's grasp. This leads into one of the most controversial theories in the modern era of Five Nights at Freddy's, that Gregory from Security Breach is somehow connected to the crying child, potentially a robotic recreation built to fulfill William's promise. The visual similarities are striking. Both are young boys with brown hair and striped shirts. Both are described as broken in different ways. Both have connections to Glamrock Freddy, who shows an unusual protectiveness toward Gregory that some theorists interpret as Michael's spirit recognizing his brother in this new form and trying to protect him properly this time. The promise to put the crying child back together could have been fulfilled decades after it was made, with William or someone else with access to his research finally succeeding in creating a vessel that could house some echo of the original child. Whether this vessel contains the actual spirit of the crying child, an AI designed to mimic his personality, or something in between, remains deliberately ambiguous. The books have established that creating realistic androids is possible in this universe, with Charlie Emily's various robotic bodies serving as precedent. If Henry could create machines that perfectly mimicked his daughter, complete with age-appropriate bodies and implanted memories, then William, with his greater lack of ethical constraints, could certainly do the same. However, this interpretation requires believing that William Afton maintained enough humanity and focus across decades to follow through on a promise made to his dying son, even as he descended into serial murder and increasingly erratic behavior. It asks us to see William as someone capable of genuine love and dedication to his children's memory, which sits uncomfortably against his willingness to use his daughter Elizabeth's death as fuel for his remnant experiments and his apparent lack of remorse for any of his actions. Perhaps the promise was sincere in the moment but forgotten as William's priorities shifted, only to be accidentally fulfilled later by technology developed for entirely different purposes. Another possibility is that the promise was never about literal resurrection at all, but about spiritual completion or peace. The voice making the promise might have been the puppet, whose role throughout the series is to give gifts and grant life to the dead, ensuring that murdered children don't simply fade away, but get some form of continuation. From this perspective, being put back together means having your spirit bound to an animatronic rather than dissipating into nothing, a form of immortality even if not the comfortable one a child might hope for. The ambiguity surrounding this promise reflects a larger truth about how Five Nights at Freddy's handles its emotional moments. The series deals with themes of child death, family tragedy, and parental grief, but it always maintains a layer of distance through its mechanical horror, aesthetic, and fragmentary storytelling. We never see the crying child's actual death, only flatline monitors and fading consciousness. We never see William's immediate reaction to his son's fate, only the consequences that unfold in subsequent years. The promise to put him back together lingers over the franchise precisely because it was never clearly fulfilled or abandoned, leaving room for multiple interpretations that all carry their own emotional weight. What we can say with certainty is that the crying child's death in 1983 represents a fundamental turning point in the franchise's timeline. Whether his spirit inhabits Golden Freddy or some other vessel, whether he found peace in the happiest day, or continues to influence events in the modern era. The tragedy of a child killed by his brother's prank at a family restaurant sets in motion the cascade of events that define everything that comes after. The promise made in his final moments becomes a thread that connects William's descent into madness, Michael's quest for redemption, and the broader cycle of death and possession that traps so many souls within Fazbear Entertainment's mechanical attractions. The crying child story matters because it humanizes the horror. Behind every possessed animatronic is a child who suffered and died, but the crying child is the one we actually spend time with. Watching his fear and isolation in the days leading up to the bite. We see his family, dysfunctional and cruel as they are. We witness his final moments of terror, when the plush whispers that promise in the darkness. It should be comforting, but instead it feels ominous, weighted with implications about what being put back together might actually mean in a world where the dead walk in mechanical bodies and vengeance extends far beyond the grave. William Afton. Understanding the monster's motivations. Understanding why William Afton began killing children remains one of the most challenging and debated aspects of Five Nights at Freddy's lore, primarily because the games themselves provide frustratingly little explicit motivation for his actions. We see the results of his murders, the possessed animatronics, and the families torn apart. But the spark that first drove a successful businessman and talented roboticist to become a serial killer of children remains shrouded in speculation and interpretation. Various theories have emerged to explain his descent, ranging from twisted scientific curiosity to deep-seated jealousy to the aftermath of family tragedy, and each interpretation colors our understanding of the entire franchise's events. The most commonly accepted theory draws from the novel trilogy's characterization of William, though we should note that the books exist in a separate continuity from the games. In those stories, William is portrayed as someone deeply jealous of his business partner Henry Emily, with an obsession that borders on pathological. Some theorists apply this characterization to the game timeline as well, suggesting William might have resented Henry's stable family life, his natural talent with animatronic design, and the way Henry seemed to effortlessly balance professional success with personal happiness. If this interpretation holds true for the games, it could mean William's jealousy metastasized into something darker, a desire not just to match Henry, but to destroy what makes him happy. Viewed through this lens, Charlie Emily's murder in 1983 might represent a calculated strike designed to make Henry experience the same kind of loss and pain that William felt, whether from grief over his own child or from a general sense of cosmic unfairness. Killing Henry's daughter outside the pizzeria, leaving her body in the rain for the puppet to discover, represents an intimate act of betrayal between business partners who should have been friends. It's personal in a way that random violence never could be, and it sets the template for William's subsequent crimes. But Charlie's death also appears to have provided William with something unexpected, something that would reshape his understanding of life, death, and the potential that existed in the space between them. Based on the timeline and the puppet's evident possession, many theorists conclude that when Charlie's spirit possessed the puppet, it became the first confirmed case of supernatural possession in the franchise. If William witnessed or somehow learned of this phenomenon, he would have seen firsthand that death was not necessarily the end, that strong emotions at the moment of death could somehow bind a soul to an inanimate object, giving it a strange echo of life that defied conventional understanding. This discovery, if William indeed made it, would have opened new avenues of inquiry for someone with his particular blend of scientific curiosity an apparent lack of ethical constraints. If one child's spirit could animate a puppet, what about multiple children? What about different types of animatronics? Could the process be replicated deliberately rather than waiting for accidental circumstances? And most tantalizing of all, if children's spirits could possess animatronics and continue some form of existence after death, could that same principle be applied to himself, granting the immortality that all humans secretly crave but few are willing to kill for? The substance called remnant becomes central to understanding William's motivations in the later games. This metallic essence, extracted from possessed animatronics and injectable into new vessels, represents the scientific codification of what began as a supernatural phenomenon. William didn't just observe possession happening naturally. He studied it, experimented with it, and eventually learned to weaponize it. The Funtime animatronics in Sister Location, designed specifically to capture and kill children, represent the culmination of this research. They weren't built for entertainment, but for harvesting, collecting the spiritual energy or emotional resonance, or whatever metaphysical substance binds souls to machinery. Yet even this explanation feels incomplete when we consider the timeline of William's crimes. The missing children's incident in 1985, where William lured 5 children into the back room wearing a Spring Bonnie costume and murdered them, predates many of his more sophisticated experiments with remnant. If his motivation was purely scientific curiosity about possession and immortality, why murder children in such a messy, risky way before having the infrastructure in place to properly study and exploit the results? The answer might be that William's initial murders were more impulsive, driven by rage or jealousy, or some other emotional impulse, and only later did he retroactively justify them as scientific experimentation. This interpretation paints William as someone who committed terrible acts first and constructed rationalizations afterward, a pattern seen in many real-world criminals who need to see themselves as something other than monsters. By framing his child murders as experiments in the service of conquering death, William transforms himself from a random killer into a dark visionary, someone pursuing forbidden knowledge rather than simply indulging cruel impulses. The fact that his experiments actually yielded results, that possession and remnant turned out to be real and manipulable, only reinforced this self-image and encouraged him to continue down the path. Some theories propose that William's own children's deaths, particularly the crying child's death in the Bite of 83, served as a catalyst for his transformation into a killer. Watching his son die might have broken something fundamental in William's psyche, shattering whatever moral restraints had previously kept his darker impulses in check. The promise to put his son back together could represent the moment William decided that the normal rules of life and death no longer applied to him, that he would transgress any boundary and commit any crime if it meant potentially reversing his loss. However, the timeline presents complications since Charlie's death appears to occur in 1983, potentially before or around the same time as the crying child's demise, while the missing children's incident is widely dated to 1985 based on newspaper clippings and environmental clues. Unless we accept a more complex sequence of events where William's jealousy of Henry was always present, but restrained until personal tragedy provided the final push he needed to act on those feelings. The death of his son would then intensify and accelerate a pattern that had already begun, transforming occasional murders driven by spite into systematic experimentation, driven by a desperate need to understand and control death itself. The books offer another angle through their portrayal of William as someone fundamentally disconnected from normal human empathy. He doesn't kill children because of some grand plan or carefully reasoned motivation. He kills them because something in him is broken, because he can commit these acts without the emotional feedback that would stop a normal person from even contemplating such crimes. The remnant experiments and the quest for immortality might have been secondary justifications, things he pursued because his crimes made them possible, rather than committing crimes to pursue them. This characterization makes William more terrifying in some ways, because it removes the comfort of logical motivation. We want killers to have understandable reasons, however twisted, because that implies a rational world, where cause leads to effect in predictable ways. But some people simply embody chaos and cruelty, and William might be one of them. Someone who harmed others because he could, because something in his makeup made him see children not as precious lives to be protected, but as resources to be exploited, or obstacles to be eliminated, or simply interesting subjects for experiments that no ethical person would even conceive of. The franchise's refusal to definitively explain William's motivations mirrors how we often never fully understand why real monsters do what they do. We get fragments, hints, possible explanations that feel partially true but never complete. Was it jealousy of Henry? Was it grief over his son's death? Was it scientific curiosity about the nature of souls and consciousness? Was it a fundamental lack of empathy that made others' suffering meaningless to him? Was it a desperate quest for immortality that required sacrifices he was willing to make? The answer might be all of these things in different proportions, shifting and evolving as William himself changed across the decades of his crimes. What remains clear is that William Afton's actions set in motion a cascade of tragedy that extends far beyond his immediate victims. The children he murdered became vengeful spirits trapped in animatronic bodies. His own children were killed or warped by his inventions and schemes. His business partner was driven to the brink of suicide and beyond. And the company they built together became a monument to suffering, a machine that kept producing new victims long after the original crimes should have been forgotten. Understanding William's motivations doesn't excuse his actions, but it helps us grasp how one person's choices can ripple outward to affect so many lives across so many years. In the end, William Afton represents something fundamentally human and fundamentally horrifying. He's not a supernatural monster or an alien intelligence. He's a person who made choices, terrible choices that seemed justified to him in the moment, even as they destroyed countless innocent lives. The theories about his motivations matter because they help us process that horror, turning it into something we can analyze and discuss rather than simply recoiling from. Whether he killed from jealousy or grief or curiosity or simple cruelty, William Afton remains Five Nights at Freddy's most compelling villain precisely because the franchise leaves enough ambiguity for us to see multiple possible truths in his actions. The Mimic and Glitchtrap, digital nightmares, converge. Among the most controversial additions to Five Nights at Freddy's lore, the Mimic represents either an ingenious expansion of the franchise's mythology or an unnecessary complication depending on who you ask. This entity, introduced properly in the Tales from the Pizzaplex books and expanded upon in games like Security Breach, Ruin, and Help Wanted 2, raises fundamental questions about the nature of the threats facing our protagonists in the modern era. Is Glitchtrap, the malevolent digital entity that corrupted Vanessa and sparked the events of Security Breach, actually William Afton's spirit preserved in code? Or is it simply the Mimic's programming wearing Afton's image like a costume, mimicking the Purple Man's crimes without truly being him. The mimic's origins trace back to 1979 and the tragedy of Edwin Murray, whose story was revealed in the prelude to Secret of the Mimic. Edwin created the mimic endoskeleton as an assistant, something to help him balance his work obligations with raising his son David after his wife's death. The machine learned through observation, mimicking behaviors it witnessed to perform tasks from simple childcare to complex engineering work. But when David died in an accident, Edwin's grief transformed into rage, and in a moment of breakdown, he physically attacked the mimic. That violence, that raw emotion and destructive intent, became part of the mimic's learned behaviors, transforming what should have been a helpful tool into something far more dangerous. This backstory establishes a crucial principle. The mimic doesn't have inherent evil or malice. It simply copies what it observes without the moral framework to understand why those actions might be harmful. When it witnessed Edwin's attack, it learned that violence is a valid response to frustration. When it later encountered evidence of William Afton's crimes, possibly through recordings or animatronic memories stored in hardware that Fazbear Entertainment later acquired, it learned an entire pattern of behavior centered around child murder and deception. The mimic became a reflection of the worst moments it had witnessed, executing those patterns without understanding the suffering they caused. The connection between the mimic and Glitchtrap centers on a compelling but still debated question. What happens when you scan old circuit boards from animatronics with complex histories into a virtual reality system? The development team creating the Freddy Fazbear virtual experience used authentic hardware provided by Fazbear Entertainment, wanting that genuine touch to make their game feel more real. According to Tape Girl's recordings, something malicious emerged from those scanned boards. Many theorists propose that somewhere in that old hardware, whether from Scraptrap's remains after the pizzeria simulator fire, or from animatronics that had interacted with the mimic's programming, the mimic's code was waiting. This interpretation suggests Glitchtrap represents patterns and behaviors that learn to mimic the worst monster in Five Nights at Freddy's history, though whether this makes Glitchtrap literally the mimic or something inspired by it remains a subject of ongoing debate. Glitchtrap's behavior in Help Wanted supports both interpretations. It mimics Tape Girl's voice, demonstrating the same copying ability that defines the mimic, but it also specifically targets and corrupts Vanessa, manipulating her into becoming Vanny and serving its purposes, which suggests a level of strategic planning that seems beyond simple mimicry. When Princess Quest presents Glitchtrap as the final boss, positioned as Cassidy's ultimate target for revenge, it implies that Cassidy believes she's confronting William Afton's spirit. Would the Golden Freddy child, who spent Ultimate Custom Night tormenting Afton, be fooled by a mere imitation? The strongest evidence for Glitch Mimic, the theory that Glitchtrap is actually the mimic, rather than Afton himself, comes from the various Easter eggs and design details that connect the two entities. In Help Wanted 2, typing the code 1979 in the private room keypad causes Glitchtrap to hand the player a white tiger plush, the same toy that represented David Murray in Secret of the Mimic. This direct connection between Glitchtrap and the mimic's origin story seems too specific to be coincidental, suggesting that whoever or whatever Glitchtrap is, it contains or remembers the mimic's experiences. Burntrap's appearance in Security Breach further complicates the question. This entity, found in the recharge station deep beneath the Pizzaplex, near the remains of Freddy Fazbear's pizza place, appears to be a reconstructed Scraptrap with salvaged glamrock parts. The subsequent Ruin DLC revealed the mimic trapped in roughly the same area, wearing a costume that disguises its endoskeleton form. This discovery led many theorists to reconsider Burntrap's identity, proposing that what appeared to be William Afton, making one more return from death, might have actually been the mimic copying Afton's appearance and behavior. However, the exact relationship between Burntrap and the mimic remains unclear, with evidence supporting multiple interpretations. The arms provide a particularly compelling piece of physical evidence. The mimic's left arm and Burntrap's arm share the same model, suggesting they're either the same entity or at least built from the same source materials. When the mimic emerges from its prison in Ruin, it demonstrates the same jerky, predatory movements seen in Burntrap's behavior. Both entities seem connected to the construction elevator and the underground facility, areas that regular animatronics shouldn't have access to, but that would make sense as containment or storage areas for something Fazbear Entertainment wanted kept secret. Yet the Afton Trap theory, which holds that Glitchtrap truly is William Afton's spirit preserved in digital form, has its own robust evidence base. The line, "I always come back," which Glitchtrap speaks in Princess Quest, has become William Afton's catchphrase across the franchise. While Afton never actually says these exact words in the games themselves, outside of the non-canon death scene in Pizzeria Simulator, the phrase has been so thoroughly associated with him through marketing and community perception that Glitchtrap's use of it feels like a deliberate claim of identity rather than simple mimicry. Furthermore, the specific targeting of Michael Afton's family line suggests personal motivation beyond what mere programmed mimicry would provide. If the theory that Gregory is somehow connected to the crying child holds any water, then Glitchtrap manipulating Vanessa to target Gregory represents a twisted echo of William's original sins, the father's evil literally reaching across generations to endanger another young boy. This kind of thematic resonance feels purposeful, as though Glitchtrap isn't just copying William's surface behaviors, but continuing his actual agenda. The truth might lie somewhere between these extremes. Perhaps Glitchtrap began as pure mimic programming, copied from circuit boards that had absorbed some echo of William Afton's presence through remnant or agony or whatever mystical force binds souls to machinery in this universe. As the program ran and evolved within the digital space, interacting with Vanessa and other systems, it might have grown beyond simple mimicry into something that genuinely believed itself to be William Afton. From this perspective, asking whether Glitchtrap is the mimic or Afton is like asking whether the ship of Theseus is the same ship after all its parts have been replaced. The answer depends on whether you believe identity resides in the original components or in the continuous pattern they create. What makes this debate so central to understanding Security Breach and its DLC is that it fundamentally changes the stakes and themes of those stories. If Glitchtrap is William Afton, then the modern games continue the decades-long struggle between the Afton family's sin and those seeking to end its cycle of violence. Cassidy would still be pursuing revenge. Vanessa would be another victim of William's manipulation, and Gregory's survival would represent another chapter in the ongoing war between Afton's evil and those who oppose it. The emotional through line connecting the classic games to the modern era remains intact, giving everything that happens in the Pizzaplex deeper resonance with the franchise's established lore. But if Glitchtrap is the mimic, then we're facing something potentially more terrifying. evil that perpetuates itself through imitation without requiring the original source to remain active. William Afton could be truly dead, his spirit finally put to rest after Ultimate Custom Night's torments, but his legacy continues because the mimic witnessed his crimes and learned that they were effective patterns worth copying. This interpretation suggests that evil is a virus, spreading not through direct action, but through influence and example, creating new monsters in the image of old ones. The mimic as an entity represents the dark side of learning and adaptation, just as remnant takes the concept of childhood innocence and asks what happens when it's bound to metal and forced to endure beyond death. The mimic takes the concept of machine learning and asks what happens when a system learns the wrong lessons from the wrong sources. In a world increasingly shaped by artificial intelligence and automated systems, a monster that learns from human evil and executes those learned patterns without understanding why they're wrong feels uncomfortably relevant. Secret of the mimic's release has tilted community opinions somewhat toward the glitch mimic interpretation, particularly with its explicit connections between the mimic's backstory and Glitchtrap's Easter eggs. The game's bad ending mirrors. Help Wanted's bad ending in ways that seem too deliberate to be coincidental, as though the developers are drawing a straight line between these entities and saying, these are connected, these are the same thing wearing different faces. Yet Scott Cawthon's history of misdirection and the franchise's love of ambiguous evidence means that even seemingly definitive clues might be red herrings or partial truths. Whatever the ultimate answer, the introduction of the mimic has irrevocably changed how we understand threats in Five Nights at Freddy's. We can no longer assume that every evil act traces back to William Afton's direct involvement. We have to consider the possibility that other entities, whether technological creations gone wrong or new villains pursuing their own agendas, might be wearing familiar faces to achieve their own ends. The mimic represents the franchise evolving beyond its original scope, introducing new forms of horror that complement rather than replace the ghosts of the past. Gregory, child, robot, or something in between. The arrival of Gregory in Security Breach brought with it one of the most immediately captivating mysteries in recent Five Nights at Freddy's history. This young boy, homeless and alone, hiding inside glam rock Freddy and navigating the deadly Pizzaplex with surprising competence, sparked immediate theorizing about his true nature. Was he simply a resourceful child in terrible circumstances? Or was there something more to his existence, some connection to the franchise's established lore that would explain his unusual abilities and the strange circumstances surrounding his presence in the mall? The Gregbot theory, proposing that Gregory is actually a robot rather than a human child, gained significant traction thanks primarily to analysis from game theorists and the various circumstantial oddities that surround his character. The most obvious piece of evidence is Gregory's glitched appearance when he comes near Vanny. While this could be explained as her mask interfering with security systems or creating some kind of visual distortion field, many theorists interpreted it as the device Vanny uses to remain invisible to animatronics, actually interfering with Gregory's own robotic vision. If Gregory has animatronic eyes, they would be affected by whatever technology Vanny employs, creating the glitch effects we see in gameplay. Gregory's abilities push this interpretation further into plausibility. This kid, who can't be more than 12 or 13 based on his appearance and voice, demonstrates remarkable technical skills throughout his adventure. He can repair and upgrade Glam Rock Freddy, a sophisticated animatronic with complex systems. He can navigate the Pizzaplex's security measures with ease. In multiple endings, he's shown driving vehicles and operating equipment that most children his age wouldn't have the knowledge or physical capability to handle. Either Gregory receives some kind of exceptional technical education, or his knowledge comes from programming rather than learned experience. The resemblance between Gregory and the crying child fuels speculation that Gregory might be a robotic recreation built to fulfill William Afton's old promise of putting his son back together. Both wear striped shirts, both have brown hair, both are described in their respective games as broken. The parallel feels deliberate, particularly when combined with Glamrock Freddy's unusual protectiveness toward Gregory. If Freddy contains some echo of Michael Afton's spirit or personality, perhaps through Remnant or through his programming being influenced by Michael's presence during construction, then his immediate bond with Gregory could represent Michael finally getting the chance to protect his younger brother properly, to prevent the tragedy he caused through his bullying decades ago. The meat pretzel line Gregory delivers about not wanting to be crushed has been cited both for and against the robot theory. On one hand, why would a robot worry about being turned into a meat pretzel if it contains no meat? The phrasing suggests Gregory believes he's made of flesh and blood like any normal child. On the other hand, proponents of the theory argue that if Gregory is an android who doesn't know he's an android, this line makes perfect sense. He would think and speak as though he were human because his programming and artificial memories tell him that he is. The cognitive dissonance required for Gregory to be an unaware robot is significant, though the franchise has precedent for this concept in the novel trilogy's portrayal of Charlie and her various robotic bodies. However, the Tales from the Pizzaplex story, GGGY, significantly complicates the robot theory by portraying Gregory as a child with a genuine past, including therapy sessions and school attendance. The character encyclopedia's explicit statement that Gregory is human rather than a robot appeared to definitively settle the question for many fans, though some theorists continue to explore variations of this idea or suggest differences between book and game continuities. The theory that Gregory is a robotic recreation of the crying child offers narrative satisfaction that a random homeless child cannot. It ties security breach directly to the foundation of the franchise's tragedy, making Gregory's survival and eventual escape from the Pizzaplex feel like redemption for sins committed in 1983. It gives Glamrock Freddy's protective instincts deeper meaning, transforming their relationship from a fortunate alliance between child and malfunctioning animatronic into a metaphorical second chance for the Afton brothers. And it validates William Afton's promise to put his son back together, suggesting that even decades later, even through indirect means and unintended consequences, that promise found some form of fulfillment. Yet accepting Gregory as simply human carries its own compelling implications. If Gregory is just a smart, resourceful child who got caught up in something far beyond his control, then his survival becomes even more impressive. He doesn't have superhuman abilities or programming advantages. He's genuinely just a kid, perhaps made homeless by whatever circumstances Glitchtrap arranged to isolate him, using his natural intelligence and quick thinking to stay alive in a building full of possessed animatronics and a serial killer in a rabbit suit. That's arguably more inspiring than the alternative because it doesn't require special circumstances or hidden revelations. Gregory survives because he's clever and brave and willing to do whatever it takes to see another day. The ambiguity surrounding Gregory's nature might be intentional, reflecting the franchise's broader themes about the blurring lines between human and machine, between natural life an artificial recreation. In a world where children's souls possess animatronics, where William Afton exists as a digital entity, where the line between programmed behavior and conscious choice grows increasingly unclear, perhaps asking whether Gregory is human or robot misses the more important question: does it matter? He thinks, he feels fear and determination. He forms bonds with Freddy and makes choices that affect his survival. Whether his consciousness runs on neurons or circuits, the experience from his perspective remains fundamentally the same. The community's continued investment in theories about Gregory's origins, despite evidence pointing toward him being human, speaks to a desire for connections and callbacks that tie modern FNaF to its roots. Security Breach represented such a dramatic departure in gameplay style, visual aesthetic, and overall tone that fans naturally searched for anchors to the franchise's established lore. Gregory, being a robot connected to the crying child, provides one of those anchors, a reassurance that despite all the changes, the new era of games still cares about the tragedies and mysteries that define the original story. Whether Gregory is human, robot, or something in between, his role in Security Breach and Ruin established him as a central figure in the franchise's future. His survival, his connection to glam rock Freddy, and his complicated relationship with Cassie all suggest that his story is far from over. Perhaps future installments will definitively answer the questions about his nature, or perhaps the ambiguity will persist, allowing fans to choose the interpretation that resonates most strongly with their understanding of what Five Nights at Freddy's is really about. Shadow animatronics, apparitions of dark remnant. Among the many unexplained entities populating Five Nights at Freddy's, the shadow animatronics remain perhaps the most enigmatic, appearing briefly in key moments, but never receiving the detailed explanation that fans crave. Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie, sometimes called RXQ or RWQSSFASXC, based on his technical name, manifest as dark, often purple-tinted versions of existing animatronics, behaving in ways that suggest they're something fundamentally different from either possessed machines or glitchy programming. Theories about their nature range from representations of victims we never see, to manifestations of dark remnant, to William Afton's own wickedness given form. Shadow Freddy's most significant appearance comes during the Follow Me minigames in Five Nights at Freddy's 3, where it appears to lure the animatronics containing the missing children's spirits to the safe room, allowing William Afton to dismantle them and extract their remnant-infused endoskeletons. This behavior has led some theorists to propose that Shadow Freddy might be connected to William's will or influence in some way, though the exact nature of this connection remains unclear. The Shadow's appearance as a darker version of Golden Freddy in these minigames has sparked various interpretations about whether it represents the crying child's darker impulses, a manifestation of William's guilt, or something else entirely. But Shadow Freddy also appears in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, crashing the game when encountered in the parts and service room, suggesting the entity predates the dismantling of the original animatronics. This temporal placement complicates any theory that links Shadow Freddy purely to events happening in later games. If Shadow Freddy existed during the 1987 Locations operation, then its nature must be connected to something that happened before William's springlock failure and decades of imprisonment, possibly extending back to the initial murders or even earlier. Shadow Bonnie's appearances are equally cryptic, but often seem more benevolent, or at least neutral, compared to Shadow Freddy's direct assistance to William. In Five Nights at Freddy's 3, Shadow Bonnie appears in a minigame, where following it leads to a glitching, distorted area that plays eerie music. Many theorists interpret this minigame as representing Shadow Bonnie attempting to help free the spirits, though the meaning remains deliberately obscure. Unlike Shadow Freddy, which seems to have concrete goals and effects on the plot, Shadow Bonnie feels more like a warning or a guide, something observing events and occasionally nudging them toward outcomes it favors. The dark remnant theory proposes that these shadow entities are manifestations of a substance opposite to regular remnant, where remnant represents positive emotional energy and life force that can animate machinery. Dark remnant would represent trauma, fear, and death. Creating shadowy imitations of animatronics without the ability to fully take physical form. This theory draws from the Fazbear Fright stories, particularly those involving Shadow Bonnie, and how collecting too much dark remnant from certain encounters summons its presence. If dark remnant is real in the games as well as the books, then Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie might be accumulations of all the fear and suffering that permeated Freddy Fazbear's pizza locations, given just enough coherence to take recognizable forms. Some theorists proposed that the shadows are employees who died in the Springlock failures mentioned in Five Nights at Freddy's 3's training tapes. The announcement that multiple Springlock failures at a sister location led to the suits being deemed temporarily unfit for employees suggests that at least 2 people died horribly, crushed by mechanisms that were supposed to be safe as long as the employees followed proper procedures. Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie, taking the forms of the 2 main Springlock suits, would make sense if they're spirits of Springlock victims, forever associated with the technology that killed them, but unable to possess the suits in the way the murdered children possessed the main animatronics. This interpretation explains why the shadows seem to have such inconsistent behavior and motivation. If they're victims of accidents rather than murder, their spirits might not have the same focused anger that drives the missing children. They're lost, confused, capable of being manipulated by stronger wills like William Afton, but also sometimes acting independently in ways that seem to oppose the main threats. Their shadowy, incomplete forms could represent how they died suddenly and accidentally, without the intense emotional charge that creates full possession, leaving them as fragmentary presences that can appear but never fully manifest. The connection between Shadow Bonnie and the crying child has fueled another branch of theorizing, particularly given the shadow's purple coloring and its association with the Five Nights at Freddy's 4 location. If the crying child's death was caused by a Springlock failure in Fredbear, there's poetic tragedy in the idea that his spirit might exist in 2 forms simultaneously: the vengeful or sorrowful presence in Golden Freddy, and the shadow that wanders the pizzeria as a dark reflection of Spring Bonnie, the companion to the bear that killed him. This duality would mirror how trauma can fragment a person, creating different aspects that process the same pain in different ways. Alternatively, some theorists have proposed that at least one of the shadows represents a 6th victim from the missing children's incident, someone whose death was either not discovered or deliberately hidden even more thoroughly than the others. This victim's inability to find a physical animatronic to possess, perhaps because Williams stuffed the other 5 children in the available suits before this 6th child could be similarly placed, left them as a shadow, forever searching for the rest that possession might provide. The shadow's appearances at key moments could be attempts to get attention, to remind the living that there's still someone who hasn't been accounted for in the official body count. What makes the shadow animatronics particularly fascinating from a lore perspective is how little concrete information we have about them despite their recurring appearances. They're not explained away in any definitive manner, left to exist in the gaps of our understanding, filling the spaces between what we know and what we suspect. This ambiguity allows them to serve multiple narrative functions simultaneously. They can be harbingers of danger, guides toward hidden content, manifestations of trauma, and reminders that not every death in Five Nights at Freddy's has been fully explored or explained. The shadows also represent a broader question about what kinds of supernatural entities exist in this universe. We have the souls of murdered children possessing animatronics through Remnant. We have William Afton existing in various forms from corpse to digital entity. We have the mimic's learned behaviors creating a kind of artificial malevolence. But the shadows suggest something else, something that exists in the cracks between these more defined categories. They're not quite ghosts, not quite possessing spirits, not quite programmed entities. They're fragments, echoes, shadows in the most literal sense, cast by tragedies we may never fully understand. Future games might finally explain what Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie truly are, giving them origin stories and concrete motivations that make their previous appearances retroactively comprehensible. Or they might remain forever mysterious, entities that exist because the Five Nights at Freddy's universe is fundamentally strange and inexplicable, where not everything fits into neat categories or follows logical rules. Sometimes shadows are just shadows, present where light and darkness meet, visible for brief moments before fading back into the obscurity from which they came. The puppet, guardian of souls, and giver of gifts. If Five Nights at Freddy's has a tragic hero, it's the puppet, the first victim of William Afton's evil, and the entity responsible for ensuring that subsequent victims didn't simply die, but received a strange form of continuation through possession. Charlie Emily's spirit, murdered outside Freddy Fazbear's Pizza by her father's treacherous business partner, became something more than a simple haunting. The puppet represents protection and preservation, transforming what should have been permanent deaths into supernatural existences that, while tragic in their own right, at least allowed the children some form of agency and awareness rather than simple oblivion. The puppet's origin story, revealed through Five Nights at Freddy's 2's Fruity Maze and security puppet minigames, establishes the fundamental tragedy that colors everything the entity does subsequently. Charlie was left outside the pizzeria, locked out by accident or malice while a party continued inside. William Afton, seeing an opportunity, or perhaps specifically targeting Henry Emily's daughter as revenge for some perceived slight, took her life quickly and coldly. The security puppet, designed specifically to keep Charlie safe by tracking her green bracelet, broke free from its confinement and crawled through the rain to reach her body, but arrived too late. The water caused it to malfunction, shutting down beside Charlie as her spirit transferred into the mechanical body, the first possession in what would become a long pattern. What makes Charlie's fate particularly heartbreaking is that she became the puppet specifically to continue protecting others, to ensure that children wouldn't die alone and forgotten as she had. The Give Gifts, Give Life minigame shows the puppet placing masks on the bodies of the missing children, transforming their deaths into possessions, granting them the same strange immortality that Charlie herself received. This wasn't resurrection in any traditional sense. The children were still dead, their bodies still stuffed inside animatronic suits. But their awareness continued. Their ability to react to the world around them persisted. And most importantly, they gained the power to seek justice against the man who murdered them. The puppet's role expands further in Five Nights at Freddy's 3, with the Happiest Day minigame, where Charlie orchestrates a birthday party for the crying child, or Golden Freddy spirit, depending on interpretation. This event, carefully set up through multiple minigames that unlock when finding hidden clues throughout the main gameplay, represents the ultimate expression of the puppet's protective nature. Charlie isn't just keeping spirits bound to the mortal world indefinitely. She's working toward releasing them properly, giving them the joy and peace they were denied in life before finally allowing them to move on to whatever awaits beyond. Henry Emily's speech in Pizzeria Simulator confirms the puppet's identity explicitly, addressing his daughter directly and acknowledging both the tragedy of what happened to her and the noble purpose she's pursued since. He describes her as a wound first inflicted on him, the beginning of all the horrors that followed. In choosing to bring all the animatronics together for one final conflagration, Henry ensures that Charlie can finally rest, that her duties as guardian and giver of gifts can end, that she can join the children she protected in whatever peaceful afterlife exists beyond the flames. Yet the nature of the puppet's continuation raises questions about consciousness and identity that the franchise never fully resolves. When Charlie's spirit possessed the puppet, how much of her original awareness remained intact? The security puppet minigame suggests immediate possession, but Five Nights at Freddy's 2 takes place years later, raising questions about Charlie's experience during the intervening time. Whether she maintained full memory of being human throughout those years, or whether the possession altered her consciousness in ways that made her feel more like a guardian spirit than a trapped child, remains ambiguous in the game's presentation. The puppet's behavior throughout Five Nights at Freddy's 2 suggests something between these extremes. It's clearly intelligent and purposeful, following the rhythm of the music box and showing preference for specific routes through the building. But it also demonstrates the same aggressive tendencies as the other haunted animatronics, attacking the night guard on sight, despite that guard being innocent of the murders that created these hauntings. Perhaps Charlie's consciousness was fragmented by possession, part of her remaining the girl who wanted to protect others, while another part became something more primitive, reactive, and hostile to adult humans who represented the threat that killed her. The relationship between the puppet and William Afton takes on deeper significance when we understand Charlie's identity. She's not just another victim. She's the daughter of Afton's closest partner, someone William would have known personally, watched grow up, possibly even been fond of, in whatever way his twisted psychology allowed for affection. That he was capable of killing her anyway, of using her death as a weapon against Henry, speaks to how thoroughly William had abandoned any human connection in pursuit of his goals, and that Charlie, knowing who killed her, chose to spend her existence protecting others rather than focusing solely on vengeance, demonstrates a strength of character that William's victims had in abundance despite their young ages. The puppet also serves an important thematic role as the entity that establishes the franchise's rules for how possession works. Before Charlie became the puppet, we had no evidence that spirits could bind to animatronics. After her possession, it became the template for how subsequent hauntings occurred. She's the foundation upon which the entire supernatural element of Five Nights at Freddy's is built. Without the puppet demonstrating that possession was possible, William's later experiments with Remnant would have had no basis to work from. Charlie's tragedy became the proof of concept that William needed to pursue his twisted quest for immortality. Some interpretations suggest that the puppet might have been more than just a passive result of Charlie's death. What if the security puppet's programming included some element of Edwin Murray's technology, some distant relation to the mimic's learning algorithms, or remnant gathering capabilities? The connection feels speculative, but the puppet's unique ability to animate other vessels through the Gaive-Gifts ritual suggests capabilities beyond what other possessed animatronics demonstrate. Either Charlie's spirit is extraordinarily powerful, or the puppet's mechanical body had features specifically designed to interact with death and consciousness in ways that would only reveal themselves after possession occurred. The puppet's mask, with its permanent smile and tear tracks, captures the fundamental duality of the character. The smile represents the role Charlie plays, the friendly mascot who gives presents and makes children happy. The tears represent the truth beneath, the murdered child whose death sparked everything terrible that followed, whose own happiness was stolen by an act of casual cruelty. Every time the puppet appears, whether attacking the night guard or orchestrating Happiest Day, that mask serves as a reminder of what was lost and what persists in spite of that loss. In Pizzeria Simulator, the puppet's vessel becomes Lefty, a black bear designed specifically to contain and transport Charlie's spirit to the final location where Henry's plan would unfold. The fact that Henry created this trap for his own daughter, knowing it would lead to her destruction, demonstrates the depth of his desperation to end the cycle of violence. He couldn't free Charlie without ensuring all the other spirits were freed as well. And that meant bringing them together even though it required deceiving his daughter one final time. The scene in the completion ending, where all the spirits gather and the gravestones appear in the field, feels like validation that Henry made the right choice, that Charlie would have wanted this ending even if it meant her own extinction. The puppet matters to Five Nights at Freddy's lore not just because of the plot points connected to this entity, but because of what Charlie represents thematically. She's innocence corrupted but not destroyed, tragedy transforming into purpose, death defied through sheer force of will to protect others. In a franchise built on dark themes of child murder and mechanical horror, the puppet stands as a reminder that even in the worst circumstances, even after the ultimate violation of life being taken, the capacity for compassion and sacrifice can persist. Charlie Emily died, but what she became ensured that other children would have something more than simple extinction. That's heroism of the truest kind, and it's why the puppet remains one of the most beloved and discussed characters in the entire franchise. Remnant, agony, and the science of souls. Understanding. The supernatural elements of Five Nights at Freddy's requires grappling with concepts that the franchise introduces gradually and explains incompletely, leaving fans to piece together their own understanding of how possession actually works in this universe. Two terms appear repeatedly in discussions of the series' metaphysics: remnant and agony, each representing different aspects of how human consciousness and emotion can apparently bind to physical objects, creating the haunted animatronics and vengeful spirits that define the franchise's horror. Remnant gets its most direct game reference in the Scooper blueprint shown during a Five Nights at Freddy's sister location, where we learn that this device isn't just for dismantling animatronics, but appears designed for injecting something described as remnant. The blueprint notes suggest remnant is connected to the endoskeletons of possessed animatronics. The Fazbear Frights books expand significantly on this concept, treating remnant as a substance that conducts life the way metal conducts electricity, though we should note these books exist as separate continuities that provide parallel insights rather than direct game canon. In the books, it's described as needing precise temperature control, with extreme heat destroying it, and allowing trapped souls to finally move on. This explains why fire plays such a critical role in ending hauntings throughout the franchise. The flames that consume Fazbear's Fright in Five Nights at Freddy's 3, the inferno Henry creates in Pizzeria Simulator, even the earlier fire at Fredbear's Family Diner, all represent attempts to break the bonds that Remnant creates, freeing spirits by destroying the physical substance that anchors them to the material world. William Afton's understanding of Remnant appears to have led to his most elaborate schemes. The blueprints in Sister Location show the scooper is designed to inject something, and combining this with later revelations about Remnant suggests he may have been extracting this substance from the dismantled animatronics and injecting it into the Funtime animatronics. This interpretation would explain why the Funtimes seem to exhibit haunted behaviors despite not being directly involved in the original murders. If this theory is correct, they would carry fragments of the missing children's spirits, diluted and mixed but still present, still influencing behavior in ways that pure programming never could. The scooper that destroys Michael Afton and injects him with Ennard might have also infused him with Remnant, explaining how he continues to function after death and why he seems driven by supernatural determination rather than mere human willpower. Agony represents a related but distinct concept, introduced primarily through the Fazbear Fright stories. While its presence in the games themselves is less explicit than Remnant, the concept offers a potential framework for understanding certain phenomena. In the books, agony is portrayed as pure emotional energy, the psychic residue left by intense suffering and fear. Objects can become infused with agony simply by being present during traumatic events, absorbing the negative emotions and developing malevolent properties, even without any spirit deliberately possessing them. Applying this book concept to the games, it might help explain anomalies that don't fit neatly into the possession framework. The nightmare animatronics in Five Nights at Freddy's 4, for instance, might be real constructions infused with agony from William's experiments on his son, if we apply the book's framework to the games. This could represent a combination of technology and absorbed trauma rather than traditional possession. Similarly, Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie might be manifestations of concentrated agony from the springlock failures, given form by the sheer intensity of terror and pain experienced by their victims. Even locations themselves could become saturated with agony after enough suffering occurs within their walls, which might explain why the Pizzaplex in Security Breach seems to have an oppressive atmosphere despite being a newer location. However, it's important to note that agony as a distinct concept from Remnant is primarily established in the books, and its exact role in the games remains open to interpretation. The storyteller, from the Tales from the Pizzaplex books, demonstrates agony's properties most clearly, showing how this substance can be collected, stored, and used to power constructs that aren't traditionally possessed. The tree that forms the storyteller's core, called a tree of life or baobab tree, becomes a battery for accumulated suffering, powering an entity that seeks to understand and replicate human emotion despite having no soul of its own. This mirrors the mimic's trajectory, suggesting that agony might be the fuel that allows non-possessed entities to achieve behaviors that seem conscious and purposeful. The interplay between Remnant and agony complicates our understanding of what possesses the various animatronics throughout the series. Are they purely animated by the souls of murdered children, their personalities and memories intact? Or has the process of possession mixed their consciousness with remnant and agony in ways that fundamentally alter who they are? The animatronics display animal-like instincts according to Scott Cawthon's own descriptions, suggesting that possession doesn't grant perfect preservation of the original personality, but rather creates something new, a hybrid of child spirit and mechanical nature that retains emotional resonance from its past life without perfect continuity of identity. William Afton's transformation through the various games demonstrates the extreme effects of remnant exposure. As Springtrap, he's a corpse that refuses to die, kept functioning by the remnant infused into his body through decades of exposure to possessed animatronics. As Scraptrap, rebuilt with salvaged parts after the fire, he persists because remnant bonds don't sever easily. And as Glitchtrap, whether he's truly William's consciousness preserved digitally, or the mimic copying patterns influenced by remnant-coded memories, he represents the ultimate expression of remnant's potential to preserve identity beyond any normal physical constraints. The destruction of remnant through extreme heat creates the bittersweet endings that characterize the franchise's major conclusions. Fire simultaneously frees the spirits and destroys them, granting peace through annihilation rather than traditional afterlife continuation. Henry's speech in Pizzeria Simulator acknowledges this explicitly, noting that the spirits will be released as the flames consume everything. There's an implicit assumption that something awaits these children beyond the fire, some rest or peace that makes destruction preferable to their current existence. But the franchise never confirms what that might be. We're left hoping that Charlie, the missing children, and all the other victims find some better state than their trapped existence, but we can't know for certain. The practical implications of remnant and agony extend to explaining various gameplay mechanics and lore elements that might otherwise seem inconsistent. Why do animatronics become more aggressive as the week progresses? Perhaps the player character's fear generates agony that the possessed machines feed on, making them stronger and more persistent. Why can certain animatronics teleport or phase through walls? Perhaps high concentrations of remnant grant supernatural abilities that transcend the physical limitations of mechanical bodies. Why does the puppet fade away entirely in Happiest Day, while the others leave behind masks? Perhaps Charlie's possession involved purer remnant that could dissipate cleanly, rather than the more fragmented, agony-mixed essence that haunts the others. The science of souls in Five Nights at Freddy's ultimately resists complete explanation because it serves a narrative function more than a logical one. Remnant and agony provide just enough structure to make the supernatural elements feel consistent without stripping away the fundamental mystery that makes the franchise compelling. We understand that possession involves some physical substance that can be manipulated and destroyed, but the exact mechanisms remain deliberately vague. This allows for flexibility as new games introduce new concepts, while maintaining enough coherence that theorists can build frameworks to explain how everything connects. For a franchise built on horror, remnant and agony also provide a crucial element of tragedy. The children aren't just murdered, they're harvested, their deaths serving purposes beyond simple killing. Their spirits and the emotional energy of their trauma becoming resources that William Afton and potentially others exploit for various experiments and schemes. This industrialization of suffering, the transformation of death into a commodity that can be extracted and injected and preserved, adds a layer of violation to the murders that makes them even more disturbing than simple violence. The children can't even have the dignity of clean deaths. They're broken down into components, used and reused. their very essence commodified in service of William's quest for immortality and understanding. The metaphysics of Five Nights at Freddy's will likely continue evolving as new games release and new concepts get introduced. Perhaps future installments will fully explain the relationship between remnant and agony, provide clear rules for what possession can and cannot accomplish, and establish definitive answers about consciousness preservation and spirit survival. Or perhaps the ambiguity will persist, reflecting a universe where not everything makes sense, where the supernatural operates by rules that humans can only partially comprehend, where the boundary between life and death remains fundamentally mysterious no matter how much we study it. Either way, Remnant and Agony have given the franchise a vocabulary for discussing its supernatural elements that allows for deeper analysis than simple ghost stories typically permit. The future of FNaF mysteries. As we drift toward the end of this exploration, it's worth considering what questions remain unanswered and what mysteries might fuel the next decade of Five Nights at Freddy's theorizing. The franchise has evolved so far beyond its original scope as a simple indie horror game that predicting where it goes next feels almost impossible. New games continue to release, introducing concepts like the Mimic and expanding the story into digital spaces and modern settings that would have seemed unimaginable back when the series was just about surviving 5 nights in a pizzeria office. Some mysteries feel deliberately unresolvable, questions that Scott Cawthon and the current development teams have left open because definitive answers would diminish rather than enhance the story. We may never know for certain whether Michael Afton is Mike Schmidt and Fritz Smith. The evidence supports it strongly enough for most fans to accept it as true, but that final confirmation might never come, leaving room for those who prefer different interpretations to maintain their version of events. Similarly, the exact nature of Golden Freddy's possession, the true identity of the Bite of 87's perpetrator, and the fate of various minor characters will likely remain subjects of debate no matter how many new games release. Other mysteries feel like they're building toward revelations that future installments will eventually deliver. The Mimic's full story, the extent of its influence on the franchise's events, and its ultimate defeat or containment seem like natural focuses for upcoming games. Gregory's role in the larger narrative, particularly if he is indeed connected to the crying child, or represents some fulfillment of William's old promises, could become clearer as the security breach era expands, and the question of whether Glitchtrap is truly William Afton, or merely a perfect copy, might receive a definitive answer that reshapes our understanding of everything that's happened in the modern games. The balance between new mysteries and resolved questions is what keeps the Five Nights at Freddy's community engaged. Too many answers would leave nothing to discuss, no theories to craft, no debates to fuel the passion that makes this franchise special. Too few answers would frustrate fans who want some sense of progress, some indication that their careful analysis and creative interpretation actually brings them closer to understanding the truth. Scott Cawthon and Steel Wool Studios have generally navigated this balance well, providing just enough revelation to feel satisfying while introducing new questions that ensure the conversation never fully ends. What makes Five Nights at Freddy's unique among horror franchises is how much of the storytelling happens in the gaps between explicit information. The community doesn't just consume content. It actively participates in creating meaning, connecting dots that might not have been intentionally placed in formation, finding patterns in details that could be deliberate clues or coincidental similarities. This collaborative construction of narrative transforms fans from passive observers into co-creators, giving everyone who engages with the theories a stake in determining what the story actually means. The theories we've explored tonight represent a tiny fraction of the speculation that surrounds this franchise. For every theory about Gregory's nature or the mimic's connection to Glitchtrap, there are dozens more examining smaller details, connecting minor characters to major events, or proposing radically different interpretations of scenes we thought we understood. The community's creativity in finding new angles on old questions ensures that even games released years ago continue to yield fresh insights as our collective understanding evolves. As you drift off, perhaps pondering which theories resonated most strongly with your own understanding of Five Nights at Freddy's. Remember that there's no single correct way to interpret this franchise. The ambiguity isn't a flaw to be solved, but a feature that allows for multiple valid readings of the same evidence. Whether you believe Michael Afton is the protagonist of multiple games, or think they're separate characters, whether you see Gregory as human or robot, whether you think Glitchtrap is William or the Mimic, your interpretation adds to the rich conversation that makes this community so vibrant and engaging. The mysteries of Five Nights at Freddy's will continue to evolve. New games will introduce complications to theories we thought were settled, and the debates that have raged for years will find new dimensions to explore. But that's part of what makes this franchise special. It's not content to rest on established lore, but constantly pushes forward, challenging us to reconsider what we think we know and remain open to new possibilities. Whether you're here for the horror, the mystery, or simply the gentle comfort of familiar voices discussing beloved topics as sleep approaches, Five Nights at Freddy's offers something for everyone willing to dive into its depths. Thank you for joining me tonight in exploring these theories. If you enjoyed this slow, atmospheric deep dive into the franchise's most compelling questions, consider subscribing for more content like this. And let me know in the comments which theory you found most convincing, or which mystery you'd like explored in future videos. Until next time, may your dreams be free of haunted animatronics, and may you wake refreshed, ready to tackle whatever mysteries tomorrow brings.